Hey everybody, welcome to the Fire Up with CJ show. Today we are going to be talking about post-traumatic stress syndrome, otherwise known as PTSD, and we have the author, and more importantly than that, we're going to be talking about some solutions and some things that have worked, that our current guest is going to be sharing his experiences working with returning war veterans. So we have Joseph Bob Rowe, who is going to be talking about his book, Waking Up from War. So welcome.
Great to be with you.
So I wanted to cover some basics first. PTSD, what is it? How would you describe it for someone who's relatively new to the whole idea?
I would describe it this way, that post-traumatic stress, and I wouldn't necessarily call it a disorder, but post-traumatic stress is the body-mind's natural reaction to having to endure impossible circumstances that one is not able to change or leave. One just has to endure it. We are wired as human beings to endure a great deal of difficulty, but it comes at a price. And some of our systems, our body, our mind, our hearts, our souls, our relationships can be compromised, but we continue on in the interest of survival. So post-traumatic stress is actually a natural reaction of the body-mind to impossible to cope with circumstances. So that's the most general definition.
Right, so it affects war veterans for sure, who are in enduring hardship. They're in war, but it affects other people as well, right? I mean, it could be anything that's an enduring hardship, as I understand what you just said.
Something that's overwhelming, that we don't have the internal equipment to cope with. We can't leave it, we can't change it, we just have to endure it, or we choose to endure it. And sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines, men and women who served in Iraq and Afghanistan and in all wars are devoted to completing their mission and to getting themselves and their buddies back home safely. And so when they're confronted with impossible, overwhelming circumstances, they cope and adapt, and post-traumatic stress can be the result of that.
Right. And so what's interesting that you point out in your book is, as a clinical psychologist, you point out that there's like this formal American psychiatric definition of post-traumatic stress, and you say that's it's not quite complete. And so you have your own framework. I was wondering if you can share your own framework.
Sure. The first kind of post-traumatic stress is a difficulty with dysregulation in the brain and the body. That's a result of this overwhelming exposure to combat-related experience in the war zone. And it manifests in a number of ways. Soldiers will often say, I go from 0 to 60 in under a few seconds. So difficulty managing emotions and regulating and modulating emotions. Hypervigilance, being always hyper alert to where the danger may come from. Sometimes intrusive thoughts that you can't control. It can include insomnia and a whole host of other symptoms that can make life really miserable for yourself and for others. By the way, numbing is another one of psychic numbing is another one of those symptoms. So both difficulty regulating emotions, but also feeling no emotion. And as you can imagine, these symptoms can make life really miserable for oneself and others. However, this kind of post-traumatic stress I don't think is a psychiatric disorder, because in fact it is the body-mind's natural way of coping with impossible circumstances.
Right.
And this particular kind of post-traumatic stress or war-related trauma can be effectively not managed so much as worked with a variety of techniques, such as meditation, yoga, qigong, EMDR, which is an eye sensitization method, and also just sort of talking and sharing with others and ratcheting down the level of anxiety. So people can generally get a handle on this kind of post-traumatic stress with some of these interventions. Also educational interventions, understanding that doesn't have to be anything wrong with me, but this is, again, the body's natural way of dealing with impossible stress. Just that can ratchet down the self-blame and the misunderstanding that comes from.
Right. Like, why am I like this? Why am I all jittery? Why am I having nightmares? That's actually normal for someone who's actually been enduring stress for the amount of time that you've been enduring. When you're describing it almost, and I map it back to some of the things that I've other guests that I've interviewed that tell me about neuroscience, they talk about kind of a reptilian lower brain, and we have a higher brain, and that, if we are constantly stimulating our lower brain, when you're in war, it's a survival game, right? It's like, I'm trying to survive and keep alive, and so your fight or flight, it seems like, would be on an always on position. Is that related? Is that the dysregulation, and I'm not sure if everyone understands those terms of what dysregulation means, or regulation. What is it that you're regulating and what's happening? Can you kind of give us a background on that, a psychoanalytical perspective on that, or neuroscience?
I think there's a natural unity among our. I like to think of things in a biopsychosocial spiritual model, a kind of integrative model, that we're whole people with different elements, and those elements are talking to one another. So by the bio, I mean brain and body. By the psycho, I don't mean psycho, I mean psychological and emotional, and having to do with our beliefs and our perspective on things, our understanding of things. Then there's biopsychosocial family, has to do with our relationships, because we are relational creatures. And then spiritual has to do with our deeper register of meaning, faith, and for some, spirituality. And these parts of us, in the best of worlds, usually are communicating with one another in a seamless kind of way. So we feel like we're a whole person. But actually, one of the things I've learned is that war trauma is like an IED blast. Its shock waves go out multidimensionally and instantaneously, and they unravel these natural connections. They unravel the connections.
So that's the dysregulation part.
That's the dysregulation and the discombobulation, if you want to use a very simple word, among these elements. So body and mind are not communicating, rather they're fragmented. Relationships are fractured and disconnected, and our understanding of things may not be updated. Our emotions, we're not able to regulate our emotions. So another word for dysregulation, the opposite is regulation, so that when a strong emotion comes, it may have some effect, but it doesn't capsize us. We don't go under. We're able to take the hit of a strong emotion and allow it to pass. But when our capacities for regulating emotion, or our capacities for thinking, or our capacities for feeling like an alive, whole person who has a measure of aliveness, bonding, capacities for regulation and for meaning and purpose, when those are fractured, then we have a profound dysregulation, not just in the body and the brain, but a disconnect between the heart and the soul. And the person, and yet we continue keeping on, because that's what happens in the cracks between these parts of ourselves. The fog comes in. You've heard the expression, the fog of war. So the fog comes in, and it looks like it's all connected, but actually it's not. And the wounds of war continue, and they wait for an environment that's safe enough so they can start to manifest, be represented, heard, and transformed.
Okay, so this makes sense. So the things that you've noticed actually work in this. I know you had two frames, and we're still talking about the first one, but for the dysregulation part, that's why meditation, which is helping the mind and body, or mind and spirit, it's actually helping reconnect those pieces. Is that why you think meditation, qigong, those are all about integrating mind, body, spirit, those kinds of things?
Well, they allow the parts of the brain to communicate with one another, to be more integrated. And they also facilitate an experience of down-ramping of anxiety, down-ramping of hypervigilance, and an experience of ease and comfort in the body, so that we don't have to be quite so hypervigilant about where the threat is going to be coming from. And the brain can just quiet down, experience a little bit of silence and pleasant experiences, and that in itself is regulating. That allows the brain to just ramp down from that high stress hormone level of threat down to a more internal, safe environment.
Yeah, okay, so I was actually reading some stuff on the internet, dangerous, I know, but they talk about intrusive memories, which are, like you're saying, recurrent, unwanted, distressing memories of traumatic events, reliving and having flashback of those events, upsetting dreams, which can cause you not to sleep, or emotional distress or physical reactions. So this is all the kind of symptomatic kind of feelings that you would have as a result of these memories.
Well, let me give you an example and try to clarify here, and that'll also lead us into the second kind of post-traumatic stress. Was meeting with a group of guys in a men's veterans group at one of our Coming Home Project retreats, and they were bandying about how they all go from 0 to 60 in under 10 seconds, and who goes to from 0 to 60 in less time, and basically sort of chattering about how difficult it is to modulate their emotions, how angry they get, and how they regret it. They get angry at their kids, or they get angry at their partners, and so on. And I was noticing that it was relatively, not easy, but relatively easy for them to speak about this kind of post-traumatic stress, the one that we're talking about. Because they do, and they have come gradually to understand that it's not their fault, that it's due to the war.
Right.
Of course, the rest of the story is not only intrusive thoughts, because that phrase doesn't begin to capture what these guys and women actually go through. The rest of the story, let's take Bob, for example, Bob Rodriguez, who is a member of the Seabees, and he ended up in the same group during the same retreat talking about an impossibly painful and conflictual experience that he had had when he shot a boy who was outside of the wire around his unit's base that he had constructed. The Seabees construct things, and the conflicts that he went through subsequent to that. And you can call them intrusive thoughts and then lump it with the first kind of post-traumatic stress, but intrusive thoughts doesn't begin to capture what happened to him. Let me describe what he articulated. He described being woken up in a cold sweat every single night of his life since that event happened in Iraq. So that's a lot of nights of your life. And the way he described it, he responded much better to the term night visitation than he did to dream, nightmare, intrusive thoughts, or anything like that. And I've come to see this so often now that in sleep, the images of scenes, traumatic scenes, will come revisit you, but you have no filter. You don't have the dream work to kind of process it, to disguise it, to make it into a story or a symbol. That kind of dream work is not going on because that capacity has been incapacitated.
Okay.
Post-traumatic stress. So it's not just that something bad happened to you, but the capacity for making sense of it or dreaming it has been compromised as well.
Wow.
So it manifests as waking up in the middle of the night, and you're back there. So for him, for Bob, he was back there, and he was looking through the sights of his rifle. And through the sights of his rifle, he was seeing the face of this boy who was outside of the wire, who he thought was carrying a bomb under his vest. And the sight of the boy in the rifle sights fluctuated back and forth with the sights of his own son. And he had twin sons.
God.
So first he'd see his sons, then he'd see the boy, then he'd see his sons, then the shot would go off. He didn't know if he had killed his sons, if he had killed the boy.
Oh my God.
And this was literally, CJ, this was torturing him for years. Now, when you get something like this, it's not explicable by a dysregulation disorder, by an anxiety disorder, by it cuts to the chase of who we are as human beings. He felt so responsible that if he didn't shoot this boy, he was jeopardizing his men. Mm-hmm. And if he did shoot the boy, it was like shooting someone who could be innocent.
Right.
And in his night visitations, it was like shooting his own twin boys.
Oh, man.
And so the amount of guilt and shame and self-loathing that emerges out of these kinds of experiences, which some people call moral injuries, are the second kind of post-traumatic stress. Mm-hmm. And we can say that it is, in a way, post-traumatic soul damage.
Wow. I mean, there's some, wow, I just don't even know what to say. I'm so taken by the story.
Well, I think in the fact that it affects you, CJ, it shows that you have a human heart.
Yeah.
A lot of the service members and veterans we work with wish they could just will it away. And they say, well, why can't I? And I say, because you have a beating heart. Mm-hmm. And civilians, especially in our country, have been instructed, by our commander-in-chief to go shopping, to not be aware of the war. And yet, when civilians hear stories of veterans, what they really went through, it really touches them. Mm-hmm. And they feel a sense of kinship and a sense of collective, we're in this together.
Right.
This hasn't been that way during this war. It's been a task for the professionals, and the civilians have really not been engaged and had much of a sense of shared responsibility. So I feel for you, but I'm also glad that you're feeling something.
Right. Well, one of the things that when we were talking yesterday that you said, in other wars, I mean, everyone was involved, and so the whole family and society was involved. So you came back, and everyone got, like, they didn't get it fully, but they were all part of the experience. Whereas now, you talk about someone going to war, in these awful war zones, and then feeling weird when they come back. It's almost like they've come to some weird land, Disneyland.
Disneyland.
Yeah.
And it's uncanny. I have been aware of just how much good faith and good wishes there exist among the civilian citizenry in our country. Mm-hmm. As a group, we're able to separate the war from the warrior in a way that we were not during the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And when we've had public programs, for example, some Vietnam vets will come up and say, oh my God, if we had had something like this during Vietnam.
Right.
Whereas they would come home and be spit on and be called baby killers and so on. There's a tremendous amount of goodwill, but people don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to express it.
Right.
And when, for a while, I didn't understand why veterans would come back, and since there was so much goodwill and people would say thank you for your service and try to recognize what they did, they still felt so alienated and disconnected. And then it finally began to dawn on me, you come home, and unlike World War II, there's no sign of war.
Right.
There's no war-related industries, there's not a mobilization, there's not a draft, it's just the professionals. So the average Joe, the average citizen, doesn't have much skin in the game.
Right.
And so they come back, and for example, take a veteran, and many do, who go back to community college. and they want to make something of themselves. They want to start a new life, get some new skills, and they go back to community college, and they're sitting in a big lecture hall with some young people who might be their age or slightly younger, but nobody knows that they're veterans. Nobody knows what they've been through.
Mm-hmm.
And these folks may still be living with their parents and commuting, and the veteran is sitting there and they've lived several lifetimes
Right.
that nobody asks them about or, is
Yes.
learning from. You can imagine what a disconnect
Yes.
that feeling is, even though the people in the audience, the fellow students and the teachers, might be very well-meaning.
Right. Yeah, they wouldn't know it. It's funny because on airplanes they do this wonderful thing where they say, if anyone who's serving, any military who's serving us, please board the airline first. And then there's kind of like, and it's kind of like, people are like applauding, like they're excited and they're happy, but, oftentimes they're wearing uniforms, and so or, when you see a policeman or, a fireman, that they're in service, and so there's this kind of deep appreciation and gratitude when they show up. Now, if that person's just sitting not uniformed in a community college, they're no different than you, but they are.
And that's why we call some of the war injuries the invisible injuries of war,
mm-hmm.
or a better term is the unseen injuries of war.
Mm-hmm.
During this season of war, and unfortunately, CJ, it tends to be a ceaseless, endless season of war, as we can see in what's happening in Syria now, which we haven't really learned how to learn from experience, unfortunately. In this season, we are managing the visible injuries of war in ways we've never been able to do before, so that many men and women are surviving who would not have survived.
Right, yes, you're right.
Technology is so astonishing,
right,
that we have Olympic caliber athletes who had 2 legs amputated as a result of war injuries, who can win medals at the Olympics, and I don't mean the Special Olympics either.
Right.
So we're very good when it comes to physical injuries. We're not so good at seeing, as you were indicating, CJ, these injuries that are not visible. One of them is mild to moderate traumatic brain injury. And an open head wound where your head is open, and I can tell you some stories of people who've come to our retreat, some amazing stories of how they've connected. But it's obviously, you can see the injury. But what about a mild to moderate traumatic brain injury, or a TBI, when your memory is affected, when your mood is affected chronically, when you're not able to connect with other people, when you become irritable without knowing why? These are all symptoms of mild to moderate traumatic brain injury. And those patients have a funny but painful saying. They say, when the hair grows over from my injury, I become a walkie-talkie. I'm walking and I'm talking, so what's your problem?
Right.
And so another funny saying is, someone will say to a veteran, well, the war is over. What's the matter? And they say, yeah, over and over and over. And this is, here we're talking about other kinds of injuries, not just physical, mild and moderate traumatic brain injury, but we're talking about moral injuries, like I talked about vis-a-vis Bob. We're talking about injuries to the capacity to actually be in a relationship. So, a lot of these men and women come home, and they want, and their family members want, nothing more than to have this remarkable reunion, and it sometimes happens,
right.
And sometimes there's a honeymoon, but actually both have changed so much. War has changed these returning service members so much that oftentimes they're not recognized. I mean, it's like, who did you send me home?
Right. Right, they've changed so much. The husband that left for war and the husband that returns, and the wife who you left at war, and the kids, everything has changed. I think that was one of the things,
It's such a major disconnect. And the children have grown. Maybe there are children now on the scene whose birth you
saw.
here's a whole new person.
Right.
And oftentimes, the returning service member wants to go back to business as usual.
Right.
Which means, let's say, being the boss of the household,
right.
telling his kids what to do, and the kids may bristle a little bit and say, excuse me, they may be thinking to themselves, well, where have you been?
Right.
And the wife, obviously, who's been, or the husband, been working overtime to hold the fort down at home, has taken on a lot more responsibility. So there's so much to work through, and there's so many rigid defenses on the part of the returning service member that intimacy becomes very difficult as well. Mm-hmm. And there's often a disconnect there when you would think that there'd be a loving, ongoing reunion that could replenish and
right.
help both of them. It's often not that case at all.
One of the most, some really powerful things that you have in your book is you were talking about Larry Long, who's a composer that came. Tell us a little bit about the song that he composed, and then I want to read the song because it's so powerful.
Some Gave All?
Yes, yeah.
Well, Larry Long is a composer who came to one of our retreats and developed some intergroup creative activities where kids of all ages could find their own voice, could own their voice, and that parents as well could own their voice, and they could start to listen to one another. We took Larry's inspiration. He was with us for one retreat, and we turned it into an amazing ritual in which kids would make art, and teens would write poetry, and we'd have art shows, and then the adults would observe the art made by their children, and then we'd all get together, and I'd carry around the mic and give the adults one word to express their reaction to seeing all of the kids' artwork, and the kids would get to hear the adults' reactions, and it brought people closer together. It helped them know one another so much better. And then the adults would go and they would compose a reading, and they would describe what their feelings were about war and what their hopes were for their children going forward. And they would present this reading to the children. And then they would listen to the children's reactions to things they had never, ever heard their parents say. And it was so empowering for the family members because the family member, and so informative for the veterans, because the veterans rarely know what's really going on in their family.
Right.
Family members rarely hear the straight scoop on what deployment was like and what the feelings were about the family. So people could really feel empowered. And I remember one child we handed the mic to, and she was commenting on an adult reading. She was about 5 years old. And she had the mic, just a beautiful little girl with braids, bright beaming face, and she wasn't saying a word. And I thought she was inhibited, and I said, it's okay, take your time. And she just was holding the mic, looking around and beaming. And finally she said, in her own time, it feels good.
Aww.
It feels good to hear from adults.
Oh,
it feels good to be in communication.
Oh, little sweetie. Oh my goodness.
Feel so isolated and left behind.
Yeah.
So this is the mischief that Larry spawned in it.
It's just beautiful piece of work. Well, one of the things that you had in the book, you said when a service member deploys, a whole family deploys, and so the alienation that you were talking about that the soldier was feeling is what the daughter was feeling too. I mean, that's what's so powerful.
No, go ahead.
I want to, I'm going to indulge myself, and hopefully you'll appreciate it too. These were some things that I read, and I actually was in tears when I read these statements that were in your book. These are super powerful. So there's one in which, these are veteran voices. I felt isolated and lonely even though I had my comrades with me. It was a void being away from my family. And this chokes me up. I felt agonized as if my heart had been ripped out of my chest. Sad, when I got to see my kids on Skype, I was happy and proud. I felt this is my last go-around, my last dance on the planet. I felt like this just kills me. I felt like I was betraying my children for my country. I was afraid when I said goodbye to my kids I wouldn't see them again. And I felt unincluded because I missed my son's first words, his first steps, his first everything. I was stuck in limbo, and my family went out on their life without me. I hated that my wife didn't get more support. Like this just kills me when I hear this. I mean, this is what, the soldiers feel when they come back from their experience. And then the family members are saying, I'm crying, but it says, I kept asking, why am I always the one who has to be strong? These are the wives, I think, or husbands that were left behind.
Grandma.
Yeah, while he was gone, our daughter almost died. I had to go to the ICU and had to go through all that alone. I was angry that he wasn't there. I found myself looking at the kids and was thinking, wait, stop, they're growing up so fast, and I didn't want him to miss it. Oh my God, I had to keep really busy to make it through. I was proud of him, but scared of having to be a mother, father, and everything all together. Jeez, I felt a little guilty because I did get to witness all those moments, but since I was there, I was also the one who got blamed. That was hard.
Right.
I would sometimes laugh at moments when I wished he was there, like when I blew up the lawnmower. Oh my God. These were just, and then this is the stuff that Lyra used to compose the song.
No. This was the stuff that we did after.
Left. Yeah. So it was
this
after.
All came from our creative elaboration of his opening up the wellspring. The song that he composed, All Gave Some Gave All, was from his discussions with Bob Rodriguez, in fact, who I just spoke about, the CB.
Right.
And that's a compilation of Bob's experiences. But the other things that you read, CJ, those come from the children-adult dialogues that we created after Larry.
Now, is that the work, so you talked about these two different types of PTSD, one in which is it just one that's a serious thing, it's dysregulation, but can be more easily addressed through the means that you talked about before. How about these other ones, when the person feels like a moral problem, an alienation, guilt and shame, like a lot of these statements, you feel the sense of guilt and shame and or maybe even betrayal in some cases, right? Like, you left me here. Right. And I think one of the things that you mentioned before were stories of people who came back and like, why did I do that? Tell us a little bit about that too, because I won't do it justice.
Right. Well, this might be a good time to talk about the idea of turning ghosts into ancestors, because that's the alchemy by which war trauma is transformed. If war trauma is like an IED blast, and if service members cope at all costs, but the price of coping is that there's residual traumatic experience which has been dissociated and socked away in the interest of survival, and if folks are waiting for that right environment, for that welcome, for that unconditional, non-judgmental, loving welcome, if people are looking for a sense of safety and camaraderie with their buddies, all of which they are looking for, and when they find it, there's a transformative process that happens. So let me describe. What happens is that the traumatic experience starts to haunt the present, and we don't recognize that it's doing that. Take somebody who's hypervigilant all the time, and it's to an extreme. If someone cuts them off on the road, they have a major reaction.
Right.
Or they have to, when they go under a bridge, they get paralyzed. They have to pull over because they think that there might be an IED, a car bomb under the bridge. Now, or somebody who's waking up at night, with their wife's neck in their hands. Which, all of this is not really uncommon. And what's happening there is that the past is haunting the present. They're not able to really live in the present. It's almost like there's a ghost afoot. And they don't recognize that this is the past that's haunting and foreclosing the present. So what we have to do is create a safe environment where hypervigilance can ramp down, where they can connect with one another and feel safe, feel in the company of kindred spirits, where they're actually listened to, where they can hear other people's stories. So there's a set of ingredients that come together to form a healing environment. And once veterans feel safe, something remarkable starts to happen. They start to represent these traumatic experiences. It can be through art, what they write, or it can be telling a little bit of a story they've never told anybody.
Wow.
What's been so incredible what's so incredible for us is that we get guys and women who are in therapy, who are on medication, who are already being treated. They've never told this to their therapist, to their buddies, to their unit members, to their wives or husbands or children or anybody. But it takes a village, CJ, and when we create this village, gradually they feel safe enough to start to talk like Bob Rodriguez talked. Easier to talk about, hey, I go, to almost brag, hey, I go from 0 to 60 in 10 seconds. No, I go in 8 seconds, But when they start to really feel safe, they'll tell you these impossible experiences that have been plaguing them, haunting them, literally, every day of their life, foreclosing the present for them. And here's what happens. As they start to represent these experiences, to present them, they are expecting shame, guilt, condemnation, judgment, unsafety, and instead what they get is bearing witness. They get open-hearted listening without any judgments, and they get complete respect and complete support. And it shifts things. It shifts things on the axis. So they take a risk, they jump in, they represent their experience, they re-experience their trauma in a different key. And because their fears are disconfirmed, that haunting ghost becomes a memory rather than a dissociated piece. So then they're left with a bad memory, which is way better than being haunted by something.
Right.
A bad memory you can talk about, you can forget from time to time. You can even learn things from a bad memory. You can. And so it becomes an ancestor rather than a ghost.
I see. So this is actually help linking in the very first thing when you're describing what PTSD, which is just enduring sense, because it's not only what you endure at war, where the man is having to possibly shoot a little kid because they're carrying something under their vest, right? There's that enduring stress, but then it's the ghost that haunts you after you come home. That's right. Enduring as well. I fundamentally didn't get that until you just said that.
Well, there's two meanings of enduring. You picked up on the second. The first one I meant with post-traumatic stress as a dysregulation of body and brain, psychobiological dysregulation. I meant that you have to endure something while it's happening,
right,
without being able to change it.
Right. Yeah.
But the other meaning of enduring is it lasts and lasts and lasts and lasts.
Right.
And it waits. This is the remarkable thing. Let me tell you, this is a remarkable thing. There's a great neuroscientist named Steve Porges. And when I finally read Steve Porges, it took me forever because it's very tough to understand. It's really, but it's remarkably important. And he explains through neurobiology why our retreats have worked. He gives all the reasons for why. And there's one point at which the interviewer asks him, and he talks about Johnny Mathis's voice. Imagine, Johnny Mathis. Johnny Mathis, that dates me, but there are a lot of children.
Johnny Mathis.
A lot of children got born to Johnny Mathis.
Yes.
to Johnny Mathis.
Got created, yes.
Got created. In any case, his point is that there's something so soothing, so warm, so welcoming about Johnny Mathis's voice. He actually says it, Steve Porges, his scientist, he said, we want it. We're waiting for the voice. And when we hear it, our whole psychobiology ramps down. And we start to feel safe. Now, this is what we create without Johnny Mathis in our retreats, a feeling of safety. It's inexplicable. But at the end of a retreat, one care provider told us, I'm not a religious person, but I have to tell you all that this is what church should feel like.
Wow. All right, so these retreats, you know, so let's say that I'm someone who thinks I may be suffering from the PTSD, the second type, which is, you know, you're feeling the guilt, the shame, the moral, the loss of sense, betrayal, and unseen injuries. And I would like to go to a retreat. I mean, how does one, you know, so that sounds lovely. Like the thing that you just mentioned, I think everyone would want. How would they go about finding a retreat in their area, or how does one even get started?
Well, unfortunately, the Coming Home Project offered our last retreat last year, and after 7 years of serving 3,000 people from all 50 states with an evidence-based approach, we haven't been able to find the sustainable funding to ramp it up to become a national default program for all returning service members and veterans, even though it's been recognized by the Defense Department and the VA as one of the top programs. So it's been a little bit frustrating. So currently, we're not offering retreats, but I chose to write the book, CJ, to present our model, to show how it works, to give voices to veterans and service members, and we also work with care providers who can be highly stressed in their work. And most of all, I wrote the book to help wake up Americans, citizenry, the civilians, who are also affected by war in ways they don't know, so that they better appreciate the experience of veterans. I also wrote it for organizational leaders who often become dysfunctional in the face of the overwhelming demands of ramping up to do more with less. And I wanted to show how some of the same ingredients that contribute to a healing environment that helps service members and care providers can also help dysfunctional organizations, because they are things like listening, dialogue, mutual respect, unconditional acceptance, lack of judgment. These elements of creating a safe environment is healing, it enhances learning, and it also enhances work. And our service provider organizations, VA and DoD, can certainly use a cultural transplant so that their care providers can feel more supported in their creative ideas that they come up with and in their day-to-day service of the service members and veterans.
You know, it's I think the challenge would be they have so many people returning, you know, so we talked about the New York Times article about the story of this one troop that they had reported on. And so, you know, the tendency is like, here, take a pill. Please just, you know, you have anxiety. We're all in kind of this avoidance, denial.
Well, I agree with you, and that's why we tend to see things in a very simplistic way. And most of the funding goes toward, for example, things like biomarkers that will be able to tell who really has PTSD and who doesn't.
Oh my gosh!
As if we still are not believing people.
Oh my God!
They still have to make their case.
Wow.
And there's phenomenal amounts of money being spent on that kind of research, whereas things like Coming Home Project and other similar programs, not identical, but similar programs, that harness the power of veteran peer support, that take it and harness it together in a safe, skilled, facilitated environment in which guys and women who really feel comfortable, who don't have to begin from zero in telling their stories, kids with other kids, spouses with other spouses, create that environment, much less expensive, demonstrably successful, unlike many of the programs that are funded to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, which have no data. So I think people look for simplistic, sexy, one-off kinds of events.
Right.
As if, having a big show, say at the Daytona 500, might bring attention to veterans. And these kind of big tent events, but they cost so much money.
Right.
And when you think about how much money could go to strengthening the bonds and utilizing the bonds that are kind of help inoculate veterans against further stress. That's to say, when they leave our retreats or when they leave a enhancing experience, they stay in touch with one another. They help bring out and support their better angels.
Right.
They help them continue on in whatever program they might have gotten into or whatever wellness practice.
Right.
They remind one another, they support one another. So there's a way to work with post-traumatic stress that enhances mental health, that doesn't involve a drug, that doesn't involve an implant in your brain, and that doesn't even necessarily have to involve a visit with a therapist.
Right.
Although, being a psychologist, I have nothing against visiting with a therapist if you need to. All of these are community-based natural interventions that are hidden in plain sight.
Right, but here's the difference. Seeing a psychotherapist, first of all, you feel a lot safer saying, I shot a little boy, right? Where a therapist may, oh my God, maybe as good of a therapist, there's probably a certain point that's like, oh my God, you're listening to this. That if you're among peers who are like, yeah, I get it. Like, I actually was in similar situations or worse where I had to do the same thing.
That's exactly right. And let me just say, and I know you know this, but it's never easy to confess and reveal things like that, even with one's buddies. Never easy. It can be traumatic. It can also be a great relief. But one of the reasons we created this therapeutic but not therapy setting in retreats is that there's a tremendous sense of stigma that prevents returning service members and veterans from getting the care and support they need. So we thought, why don't you just invite families, pay their way from wherever they were in the country, bring them out to California, and give them an experience of connecting with other families, having a good time, learning some stress reduction protocols and wellness practices, eating well, being outside, exercising. And lo and behold, we had discovered a methodology which is kind of ancient, and it has 5 different parts. Meeting in small groups, not therapy groups, but mutual support groups.
What's small defined as 5, 10, 15, 30 people?
5 to 12.
5 to 12, okay.
The second element is wellness practices, qigong, yoga, meditation. The third element is creative arts, arts and crafts, painting, singing, poetry, journaling, dancing, music. The fourth is being in the great outdoors and doing vigorous exercise, away from the beaten path. That's healing in itself. And then the fifth is the kind of secular ritual I described before, when children and adults got together in this ritualistic way where they could hear one another's experience. And when I look at all of these 5 elements that made the retreats work, this non-psychiatric setting, it's amazing, CJ, because they've been used since time immemorial to transform stress and trauma. Look at them. The first one, dialogue. I mean, that's been around forever. The second one, religious practice, right? Actual practices like yoga and meditation, except they're not in a religious key, they're in a secular key. The third is expressive art. From the time of the cavemans, we've been expressing ourselves and the traumas and how to make meaning from our traumas through expressive arts. All of us know since time immemorial how soothing it is to go into a big redwood grove or to paddle down a river, this raging river with your buddies. It just feels uplifting and enhancing. And then these secular rituals are part of recognizing our experiences, welcoming home our veterans, helping them integrate what they've done. So we realized that we were onto something. It wasn't the kind of quick fix you were just talking about. Hey, we're going to fix this symptom with this technique. The issue itself is a community issue because we're all affected by it. The injuries happen in community. They happen with your unit. So the solution, the healing, has to happen in community with a cadre, not just of fellow vets, but also civilian helpers who are there to show that civilians care, working together. And this is why our retreats have been so successful.
And what's so powerful about that is that the power is its simplicity, and then also you can replicate it. You can get 5 or just create a Facebook page that you can communicate daily with. You get together with groups. I mean, there's so much you can do, I think, with technology nowadays.
I pick up on your comment on Dave Phillips' article in the Times last week on the 2-7 Marines.
Right.
Had, since they returned home, had suicide after suicide after suicide, to the point where they weren't getting the help they needed in the VA. The VA has many good people, many good programs, but has a dreadful record when it comes to suicide prevention, and so does the DoD. And they couldn't find the proper register, people who could meet them at the depth of their experience of despair.
Right.
And instead, the remarkable thing that we were talking about the other day, CJ, is that they themselves, without Coming Home Project, they discovered the resource that is community. They start connecting with one another more, supporting one another, going on outings together, hiking in the great outdoors, doing most of those 5 elements, demobilized. The trouble was they had to come up with it themselves. And if they had had a program, maybe they would have lost a few fewer people before they came up with it.
Right.
But they're leading the way. They already know what heals.
Yeah, a really powerful article, I think, and that it is a testament to that community matters, for sure. And that the dialogue is healing. In any, whether it's like AA or a girlfriend of mine is starting. She had an abortion. She has groups of people, and it's just the talking is so transformative, because you realize that what you're going through is a human experience. Everyone can relate to it if they don't shut their hearts from it.
That's right. And the way it works in group is that the veterans will be standing back and someone will be talking. Someone dives in. Right, in every group someone dives in. Someone says something. And then the other people are thinking, oh my God, that's me. How did they know that?
Right.
And they don't feel so crazy anymore. Because the problem, CJ, is that so many trauma survivors and war trauma survivors feel crazy, that it's just them. And there's nobody else. When they realize that they're not crazy, that everybody goes through this kind of thing, that everybody has some effect of war trauma, even if it's more major or more minor, then they feel, as you were saying, that they're among friends, that they belong, that they're not an anomaly somehow, some alien from another planet. And belonging and trust and safety, and actually the sense of trust and belonging has been found to reduce rates of suicide in some units. So again, the data is there for people who, if they open their eyes and mobilize this resource hidden in plain sight.
Yeah, and then of course this resource. Waking Up for More, the book that you wrote, A Better Way Home for Veterans and Nations. It seems like this would be a good place to start, even if it's, okay, I don't know if I have the energy to get a group together, but, I mean, you read these stories, and they're just so powerful. You're like, wow, that's me. You know, you may not be in a group, but you can read and go, wow. And, you know, I wasn't even in this group, and I could say, yeah, that's me. Like, if I were there, that would be me too. You could
relate to it.
Yeah.
And that's what's so important. I want to help mobilize civilians, care providers, policymakers, deciders, all of us, the people who elect the deciders, to wake up to the reality of war, that these veterans, their family members are real people. And as you read their voices, it's so beautiful the way you read it with such emotion. This is what's called on the streets real talk.
Yeah.
Real talk. And real talk goes to your heart. It goes directly. It bypasses everything else. And I think if more people could respond like you, CJ, take an interest in veterans, learn about them, talk to a vet, get to know a vet, see how you can connect, make some kind of dialogue and common cause, feel that you have skin in the game, feel a sense of shared responsibility. It makes all the world of difference.
Thank you so much for the beautiful piece of work that you created and sharing it with us all. Waking Up from the War, Joseph Vobro. Thank you. Thank you again.
Pleasure to be with you, CJ.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. I would love your support in any way by giving me comments below, or to subscribe to the show or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.